Hi everyone, and welcome back to another Hoya cross-edge tips video. Today I'm going to be sharing with you an idea I had relatively recently. I haven't yet decided whether or not it's worth it. It can be a little bit awkward to execute, but that's why I would encourage you to try this for yourself and see how it compares to other solutions. So the trick I'm talking about today is that in theory it's possible to use U-wide and 3 U-wide moves to pair some cross edges, a bit like how last 8 edges is done. However, with the condition that you must immediately undo those wide moves afterwards, because obviously not all centers will be solved. Also, you do need to have at least 2 pieces in F2L slots for this to work. So it doesn't work for 4x4, but it could work very well for cubes with more pieces like 6x6 and 7x7. It's also important to note that you should not use D-wide moves to pair pieces in this way, as you will move around the D layer and therefore any cross edges that you may have already solved, and also slots that you have unsolved. So this can get confusing and I don't recommend it. So instead of using D-wide moves, you should use 3U-wide moves if you're going to use this technique. Now, for the basic way this technique works, you're going to want, as I said just now, 2 pieces in F2L slots. And if they're in adjacent slots, like these two, then you want them to be in different orientations. So as we can see here, the midge is oriented in the front and the wing is misoriented in the back. And if your 2 pieces are in opposite slots, like here, we've got the midge and then the wing back here, then you want them to be in the same orientation. So as we can see, the wing is still misoriented and now the midge is also misoriented. So let's take this case, for example. We have one wing solved, we have our other wing here and it's oriented in the front, and then our midge is misoriented in the back. And so what we can do, we can just do a U-wide move to pair them up in this back slot, and then we can do L, U, L prime to bring them to the top layer, and then undo with a U-wide prime. And now we have this nice block case that we can insert in 3 moves, just like that. Now, just to quickly note here, it's important that once I'd done that first U-wide move, I did L, U, L prime instead of L, U prime, L prime. Because now, when I undo this U-wide move, like that, I have to do a U2 to set up before I can insert this block, whereas before I didn't have to do that at all. So that's just something to watch out for. And this works exactly the same way with 3 U-wide moves. So here we've got, again, one wing solved, the other wing here. This time it's oriented in the front right, and our midge is misoriented in the back right. So here we can just do a 3 U-wide to pair them, just like this. And now, as you can notice, this block is oriented. And before, when we paired up the pieces in the back, they were misoriented, so we could just take them out with L and U moves or R and U moves. But here, if we just take them out with R and U moves, then this block is oriented, and that's not a great case. So instead, what we want to do from here is do something like F prime, U2, F. So now, as you can see, this block is misoriented in the U layer, and when we undo a 3U wide move, we can now insert them just the same as before. Now, before I show any more examples, it is important to note that when you've got one wing solved and 2 other pieces in adjacent slots like this, especially if they're in side slots, so like the 2 right slots or the 2 left slots, then look out for the orientations, because if the midge is oriented and the wing is misoriented, then you can do a really nice 5-move setup into the 3R wide U2 3R wide prime trigger, and that could be faster than this for you. However, the alternative solution for this case would be 3U wide prime, R prime U R, 3U wide, 3R wide U 3R wide prime. And that's actually the same number of moves, so you may find you prefer using this technique instead of the other one. And as I said before, this works with any case where multiple pieces are in adjacent slots and in different orientations, but the most useful is when the wing is oriented and the midge is misoriented, because these cases are generally worse. So another great use for this case is when both pieces are in back slots, and because they're both in the back, they're both in adjacent slots. So the orientation here is different, which means we can use this trick. So here we can do U wide prime, L, U prime, L prime, U wide. And now we have this block in the U layer and we can insert with 3R wide, U prime, 3R wide prime. And the same thing applies for when both pieces are in the front slots. So again, they're in adjacent slots, the orientation is different, so we can use this trick. In this case, we have our midge here and the wing here. We could do 3U wide, L prime, U, L, 3U wide prime, 3R wide, U prime, 3R wide prime. And you may find this nicer than the setup to 3R wide U2 3R wide prime, which is also 8 moves, but the setup you have to do involves R and L moves like this at the same time. So you might find that a bit difficult to execute and that the other trick is faster. Then in this case, we have our midge here and it's misoriented and the wing here and it's oriented. And so if we were to do, say, a 3U wide prime to pair them up, instead of doing something like F prime U2 F, then an alternative you can do would be to do a sledge. So R prime F R F prime. And that brings them to the U layer and they're misoriented. So then we can undo with 3U wide and then just insert as before. And then you can use this idea for when both pieces are in diagonal slots, but they're in the same orientation. So here we've got, again, one wing solved, the other wing is here, it's misoriented, and the midge is back here and it's also misoriented. So in this case, we can do 3U wide 2, we can do L prime U2 L to put the block over here, and that's important because then when we do 3U wide 2 again to undo, it's positioned nicely so that we can just insert it in 3 moves as before. Then for something like this, again, wing solved, this wing here and it's oriented, and then the midge in the back and it's also oriented, we can do 3U wide 2, and then this time we could take it out with F prime, U prime, F, so that when we do 3U wide 2 again, we can just insert with the same 3 mover. Then there are situations where you compare all of your edge pieces with this trick. So on 5x5, this would be all 3 of the pieces that make up one edge at the same time. On 6x6, it would be all 4 of them. That's possible as well. And on 7x7, it also works. And if you're able to pair up the pieces and they end up misoriented in the front right slot, then you can solve the edge first and then undo the centers afterwards. So for example, how you might go about this is, in this case, we have one wing solved. We have the midge is oriented in the back right, and the other wing is misoriented in the back left. So instead of just pairing them up with a U-wide move, and then they're not in a great position because they're oriented and in the back, so if we take them out, we get not a great case. Instead, before that, what we can do is we can do an F prime. So now, as you can see, all of these pieces are just one slice move away. So this time we can do U wide, 3U wide. And now, all 3 pieces are paired together. They're misoriented in the front right slot, and so we can insert them with R prime, F prime, R, F. So that solves this edge, and then we can undo centers, U wide prime, 3U wide prime. And this extends to other similar cases as well. In this case, we actually only have one piece in a slot. It's this wing, it's misoriented in the back left, and we have this piece and this piece here. And as you can see, these two are in opposite orientations, they're next to each other, so they're one slice move away from being paired up. And so what we can do is we can use that to our advantage. We can do, again, an F prime. And now, as we can see, we have all 3 pieces ready to be paired up with U wide prime, 3U wide prime. Then we can do R prime, F prime, R, F, just as before, and then undo with U wide, 3U wide. And then a similar idea, this time the midge is in the back left, and the other wing is in the U layer. What we can do here is we can do an F prime, and then we compare these 3 pieces with U wide, 3U wide 2, like that. Insert them just like before, and then undo with U wide prime, 3U wide 2. Also, most of the cases I've shown you so far have paired the pieces into a front slot, and this is very easy to recognize and insert. However, it can also be relatively easy to insert the pieces if they're paired into back slots. Now this is a more complicated case. We have both wings unsolved and they're both oriented in the back slots. And in this case, we have the left wing oriented in the back left and the right wing oriented in the back right. And now these 2 pieces are in the same orientation and they're in adjacent slots, but there is a nice way we can deal with this. And I'm also at the same time going to show you how you can insert pieces from back slots into the front. So to solve this case, we can do an F. So now we're set up to these 2 that can be paired in one slice move, but not this one. So we'll keep track of that. So we compare these 2 with U wide prime, and now we have this block and we have this piece here. And what we know is that when we slice back, this piece is going to go back to here. So what we want to do is move this block back to here, so that when we slice back, it pairs up this piece with those 2 that are there. And the way we can do this is with R prime, F, U prime, F prime, R, like that. And that flips them and inserts them into the back in 5 moves. And then when we do a U wide, then we have these pieces all paired up. So that is a bit complicated. It's not the easiest thing to recognize, but it can be quite useful, I think. And then here, once we have all three pieces solved, we can just insert them with D, R, D prime. And it's very important to note here, that trick only works when the centers are solved, specifically this right-hand center. Because if you watch what happens from this angle, the moves that we're doing changes the orientation of this center. So you have to do that trick only when you've realigned centers already, because otherwise you will mess up this center and then you'll have to start your solve pretty much from scratch. And also, if you pair pieces into the back and they end up misoriented, then you can also directly insert them to the front in the bottom. Now, in this case, we have our midge solved, and we have our left wing, which is oriented in the back left, and our right wing is misoriented in the back right. And so what we can do here, because these two are already in the right orientation relative to each other, we can do an F move. So that puts this midge also in the same orientation. Then we can pair them up with U wide prime, 3U wide 2. And then we can insert this block of now paired pieces into here. Now, what we don't want to do is R2, F, R2, because as you can see, this messes up this center. So what we want to do instead is an F prime before that. So we would do F prime, R2, F, R2. So now the orientation of our centers has been preserved, so we can just undo with U wide, 3U wide 2. So now I'm going to show you briefly that the same techniques can be applied to 6x6 and 7x7, and that there are slightly different applications for those. So for 6x6, we could have this case, for example, we have one piece solved, then we have another piece here, and a piece here, and a piece here. And as you can see, they're very conveniently set up to be solved, those three, like that. So what we could do then is take them out in the U layer some way, like that, and then insert this block. But another way we could do it is if we notice this wing is solved, and we can set it up to here, so that when we slice all of the other pieces over, they're paired in the front right slot, and then we can insert them more easily. So what this case would look like would be setting up this wing to here with L, F prime, L prime, and then we would do a U wide prime, a 3U wide prime, and a 4U wide prime, just like that. Then insert with R prime, F prime, R, F, and then undo all of those U moves. Then on 7x7, this is especially a common case where you've got some pieces solved and a couple of inner pieces unsolved. And as we can see, we've got one piece here and we've got one piece here. And there are a couple of different ways to tackle this. What we could do is we could just pair up just these two pieces. So in this case, we would do a 4U wide 2 to pair them up like that. Then we could take them out with F moves. So we could do something like F prime, U prime, F. And then when we do our 4U wide 2 again to fix the centers, we now have this block, which we can just insert with slice moves like that. The other alternative is a bit like what I just showed on 6x6. We can set up all of the other pieces as well into the same slice. So as we can see, these two are in the same orientation and they're in diagonal slots. These pieces, if we set them up to here, we want them to be in the opposite orientation relative to these two. So what we can do is R prime, F, R, just like that. And now we can slice these to here. We can slice this block to the front, and then we can slice this all to pair up these pieces just like that. And then we can insert with L, F, L prime, F prime, which is just the mirror of the thing you would do on the right. And then we can undo our centers. Now, another way that you can deal with when you pair up pieces and they become oriented in a back slot is you can use the R wide 2 trick, but only in very select circumstances. Now, I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail as to how this works, but you will be able to see the cases where I use this trigger on my last cross-edge document. So hopefully you can see where it works and where it doesn't work and why that will be. Now, let's take this case, for example. We have, again, a wing solved. We have our midge oriented in the front right, and the other wing is oriented in the back left. Now, the obvious thing to do here is a 3U wide 2 to pair these up. However, if we take them out with L moves, then the block is oriented, and we don't really want to be doing B moves to take them out like that, because that's not very good. So what we can do instead is we can notice that we have just another case now, a block case here. And because we know that the R wide 2 trick doesn't affect the top center and the front center in any way, we are actually safe to use it. So in this case, we can do 3R wide 2, U prime, L, U, L prime, 3R wide 2, and then undo the 3U wide 2. Now, the reason that worked is because we paired the two pieces on the left, and we need to insert them to the right. And that's very important because, as I taught you in my R wide 2 trick video, then when you're setting up pieces that are on the left to go into the right, then you need to do 4 moves to set up so that you don't break up any cross edges that you might have already solved. Whereas when you're solving pieces from the right into the right, then you actually break up this cross edge when you do the R wide 2 move. So for example, I'll just show you on 6x6 briefly. We've got one piece we need to solve. It's here, it's in the back right, and it's oriented. And so we would solve this with R wide 2, U, R, U prime, R wide 2. And you'll notice there that I only did 3 moves to set up, because when we did that first R wide 2 move, then the cross edge that was here gets moved. And then when we solve a piece, say from here to here, something like that, this cross edge is not affected. So we only need to do 3 moves to set up. However, when the piece needs to go to this right hand slot and is on the left, if we do an R wide 2, then this cross edge obviously doesn't move. So we can't just do 3 moves to set up, we need to do a 4th, like that, and then solve it. And so if I show you this case on the right again, we do the R wide 2, so that's flipped this center 180 degrees. Then when we solve this piece, the center rotates again, and then when we do the R wide 2 to fix, the center rotates another 180 degrees. So if you try to do that when the centers are not solved, or like they're misaligned by a U wide, for example, then what this is going to do is it's going to mess up the orientation of this center, and then when you slice back, this center will not be solved. So it's very important when you're doing this trick, for example, if you were to do, in this case, we've got this wing here and the midge back here. We could pair them up with a U wide 2 like that, but now we cannot insert these with the R wide 2 trick, because if we try to, like that, we can see this center here is matching with this cross edge that's been moved. But if we just insert this normally, then this center is now misaligned and we can't use this. And I mean, you could do something like U, R prime, U2, but I don't think that's very good. So that's quite a complicated idea. And if you're struggling to get your head around that, then the thing I would recommend doing is just checking out my last cross edge document and just have a look for the cases that I've listed where you can use this trick. And don't really try to use it for any other case, because it probably doesn't work. The most important thing to know is that with the R wide 2 trick, if you're solving pieces that are on one side of the cube, this piece is on the left hand side, and it needs to go to the right hand side of the edge like this, then you don't affect the orientation of any centers by solving this, because those 4 moves keep this center in the same orientation. However, on the right, then if you do the optimal solution, which is only 5 moves, then this center changes orientation. So you need to be really, really careful when you're using this trick that you're conscious of the alignment of your centers and that you don't break the orientation of those centers during solving your cross edges and then mess up those centers, because that can be quite difficult to fix. But just once more, I'll demonstrate a practical application of this trick. So here we've got one wing solved again. We've got our midge that's misoriented in the back right and our wing that's oriented in the back left. Now we compare them with a 3U wide prime like this. And now we know that even though our centers are misaligned and we want to preserve the orientation, these paired pieces are oriented and they're in the back left, and they need to go to the right hand side of this edge. So we can use the R wide 2 trick here. We can do 3R wide 2. We can insert them with U prime, L, U, L prime, which, as you can see, does not change the orientation of any of the centers to how they were before. It looks a bit messed up here, but when we do the 3R wide 2 and then the 3U wide, as you can see, the centers are all still solved. So just know that you can use this R wide 2 trick in conjunction with pairing pieces with U wide moves, but you have to be very careful for exactly when you do it. So like I said before, I'd recommend referring to my last cross edge document to see exactly where this case can be used, and being very cautious with how often you implement it. And finally, there are some slightly more random and less intuitive applications of this trick that could still be very useful, so I want to go over them now. Now, I showed you before a way to flip and insert into an opposite slot some pieces that you'd already paired, so that when you slice back, you pair up an entire edge. And I'm going to go over that again. So this case, for example, we have both of our wings oriented in the front and they're in the same slice like this, and our midge is oriented in the back right. So what we can do here is we can do an F to start setup to this case, and now we can see these two pieces are able to be paired in one move, which we can do with U wide prime. Now we know that when we fix our centers, this piece is going to slice back to here. So if we want to get these pieces to here, and we can do that with R prime, F, U, F prime, R. And so now when we slice back with the U wide, we can do an F prime just to finish, and our centers are all fine. So techniques like that are really useful to know. They're just 5 moves and they insert something into an opposite slot and they flip its orientation. So that can be really, really useful to know for a lot of cases. Then there are cases like this. We have both the wings here, one of them solved, one of them is misoriented, and we have our midge, which is oriented in the back. Now these two are in diagonal slots, as you can see, but they're in opposite orientations. So we can't just do a 3U wide 2 because that doesn't pair them up. So what can we do instead? Well, we can just solve this piece because that puts this wing that was solved here. And now these two are set up and they can be solved in just one move. So this is just a case that I've shown you before, like that. And probably my favorite application of this case is for flipped edge cases like this. So here we've got a wing solved, the midge is misoriented in DF, and then our other wing is back here, it's oriented in the back right. And we could bring it to the U layer and then solve this case, but an alternative to that is to just do an F. And now, as you can see here, we're set up for slice, flip, slice. And then we can just end with an F prime. And there are a few different ways you can do this. I'm not going to go over all of them, but it's quite nice to know. So pretty much everything I've shown you here can be applied on 5x5, 6x6, and 7x7, but it does get a bit more complicated as there are more pieces to deal with. Also, this trick is quite dependent on the orientation and the slot position of each of the unsolved pieces, so there are quite a few things to consider which can make it harder to recognise. But at least for solving two pieces which are both stuck in slots, if they're in the necessary orientations relative to each other, then this trick can be quite useful. It can be difficult to recognise and execute, so you may find that a lot of these solutions are slower for you than the alternatives, but I think it's still worth a try. And perhaps with more experimentation, especially on 6x6 and 7x7, it could be really useful for the top level of Hoya solving in the future. So that's it for this one. Thanks a lot for watching.